The king woke up as someone grabbed him by the front of his shirt and pressed him against the wall. In the semi-darkness, the king could not see anything, and the wine he had drunk the day before continued to spin his head and muddle his mind. The king rubbed his eyes and shook his head. He was finally able to somewhat make out the people who were surrounding him now. They were half-naked swarthy men, dressed in capes made of feathers and animal skins. In their hands, they held strange-looking clubs, with some glittering plates on the edges. One of them was taller than the others by 2 heads, and his chest, covered with tattoos, was like a barrel. Next to him stood the other half-naked man in a headdress decorated with feathers that resembled the tail of a peacock. Closest to the king was a man in black armor, painted with gold, that gleamed in the light of the torch.
"You thought you'd play your father?"
he asked. The king immediately recognized him.
"To Braganza,"
he muttered.
"You're finally in my hands. Oh, how many times I have dreamed of this meeting. You sent men to find me, didn't you? Well, here I am, in front of you. Aren't you happy to see me, Joao? Or are you? I'm asking you, coxcomb."
With these words, the duke shook the king once more. The king began to guess that this was not a dream.
"Captain Daniel killed you,"
the king said slowly. Hearing the king's answer, Nuno shuddered. So the duke was right. His parents were killed by order of the king. Nuno felt his hands itching. Now he wanted to take this bastard out of the duke's hands and start beating him against the wall himself, knocking him to the floor and finishing him off completely. Ocotlan looked at Quilting. The priest caught the look and responded with a smile. Everything was going as planned. One Tlaluacatli was going to kill the other, but it should have ended sooner. Otherwise, who knows how many more Tlaluacatli were en route to this huge stone house. The duke grabbed the king by the collar and led him out onto the balcony.
"Look over there,"
he shouted, pointing to the mouth of the Tagus River. The short May night was coming to an end. In the pre-dawn twilight, the king, looking across the water, could not miss the giant ship moving straight toward the port. The ship was so huge that the houses near the port seemed like dice next to it. The king had never seen anything like it. It occurred to him that everything that was happening to him could still be a dream. He pinched himself, but the ship didn't disappear. Moreover, in the courtyard of the castle, the king could see a lot of savages, whose attire consisted of tufts of feathers, animal skins, and gold chains. In their hands, they held primitive pikes, clubs, and bows.
"Do you know how many cannons there are on that ship?"
The duke shouted, pointing again at the giant ship with an incomprehensible pyramid in the middle. Nuno was surprised. What kind of cannons could there be on the ship?
Look well."
The duke continued to shout, pointing towards the river.
"I have only to give the order, and this ship will blow the whole of Lisbon to pieces with just one volley, with a single shot from all the cannons, and all that will be left of your castle is a pile of sand. You won't survive either because you'll end up in hell."
The duke treated him, the king, with such rudeness that Joao still believed that everything happening to him was a nightmare. No one had ever allowed themselves to talk to him like that, much less grab him by his clothes. Ocotlan and Quilting exchanged glances again. Yes, they had to get back as soon as possible. Many warriors had already managed to get hold of the Tlaluacatli's weapons made of the unknown precious metal during the battle. It remained only to outfit each warrior with one, and to do this, it would be necessary to take all the other iron macuahuitl and their strange bows attached to sticks from this big stone house.
"What do you want from me, de Braganza?"
The king muttered.
"Yes, now you are talking. You must sign this."
The duke pulled out a scroll tied with a white ribbon from the depths of his armor and shook it in front of the king's face. Quilting immediately recognized this ribbon, which he had been looking for and could not find before he went ashore. What a scoundrel this Tlaluacatli was. He stole this ribbon from him, from a Tlaluacatli, to whom he was supposed to pay tribute.
"What is it?"
the king asked. The duke released the king, unfolded the scroll, and held it up to Joao's face.
This is the law of the Cortes, the law that will transfer the power of the king to the Cortes of Portugal, the law for the introduction of a real parliamentary republic in the country. You will sign this law, and from now on you will ask the Cortes for consent for every step you take if it concerns the affairs of the state. Is that clear?
The king was silent and looked with horror at de Braganza's face.
I'm asking, do you understand? Or should I throw you off the balcony? In that case, I will sign this paper myself and will tell everyone that the signature is yours. Then, according to the new law, we will choose a new king for Portugal who is more accommodating.
The king did not answer and only looked from the paper in the duke's hand to his companions, then to the giant ship equipped with 1,000 cannons and the savages behind the duke. Either the king's dream had turned into a terrible reality, or, on the contrary, reality had transformed into a terrible dream. The duke thought,
Now the king will do what he is ordered to do. He will sign this law, or the king of Portugal will have to be killed.
Suddenly, the duke noticed. The king's lips parted with a smile that was painfully familiar to him. That hereditary smile that the duke had also seen on the lips of Afonso V at those moments when the late king had made fatal decisions. What could it mean? The duke began to consider that somehow he had possibly made a big mistake. Young Ocotlan rushed straight from the coastal bushes into the narrow bed of a fast river and immediately surfaced on the other bank. The force of his dive was such that the river never had the chance to carry him downstream. After getting ashore, Ocotlan went deeper into the jungle and then slowed down a little. His pursuers had to catch up with him, although half of them were already floating down the river, immobilized by poison darts. After running away from the river for a decent distance, Ocotlan finally stopped. The dozen warriors running after him also stopped in surprise. The enemies pointed spears at him.
Binaza!
Ocotlan shouted as he raised his arm bent at the elbow with his fingers spread out to chest level. Only the Zapotec people greeted each other like that. Then Ocotlan tore off his wet cape and turned his bare thigh to the pursuers. A brand was burned on it, the image of Cosillo, the ticitl of rain and lightning. The warriors who had caught up with Ocotlan exchanged glances. There was fright in their eyes. Only members of the Tlaluacatli family had such markings on their bodies.
I am Ocotlan of the Atlatl of the city of Quilpan.
Ocotlan said,
I am helping our people in this war. Never, you hear, never will we be defeated, because it's me telling my father where and when the Aztlan warriors are going to march. That's why we always beat them, or we manage to get away from them. Look around! You've already lost half of your friends.
The warriors looked around. Only now did they notice that half of their squad had disappeared.
Your friends will become slaves. They won't be killed, and then I will help them escape and return to their mothers and wives. We must take care of each other because the people of Aztlan have many warriors. We also need to have many warriors if we don't want to become part of Aztlan, pay tribute to them, or kill our people every 20 days at their damn festivals.
The warriors lowered their spears. Some of them were missing one ear. This meant that they had already been captured by Aztlan's people before.
I saw you on the pyramid of Quilpan.
One of the warriors said,
I remember you and your mark. We're leaving. May Cosillo help you.
He turned around and walked towards the river. The other warriors followed him. Ocotlan watched his fellow tribesmen go, covered himself with his loincloth again, and walked in the other direction. Cotl squinted at Nuno and Anacaona and whispered,
Ocotlan, it's time to finish with these Tlatok.
It was an order. At that moment, Ocotlan was supposed to run up to the Duke and the King, who were standing on the balcony, and throw them over. If they survived, Ocotlan would have to finish them on the ground. It would be necessary to finish off everyone because it would be dangerous to capture these foreign Tlatok and their people. Who knew what might come into their heads if they were all left together inside this big stone house? That was the plan of the cunning Cotl, but Ocotlan had other intentions. As long as Ocotlan could remember, and there were so many times his family had told him the stories, his people had always fought with Aztlan. He had found himself in Tlaluacatli by accident. His intention was to visit the lands of the Totonac tribes in order to meet the altepetls of the conquered cities and tell them that the Zapotec tribes did not submit to Aztlan and to continue to fight that insatiable monster. He wanted to tell the Totonac people they could run to the Zapotecs and join the fight. When Ocotlan received an invitation from Codal, Tilatoni of Tlaluacatli, and agreed to serve there, he did not yet know that Tlaluacatli was not a city, but a large bamboo boat. So, Ocotlan turned out to be a captive of Tlaluacatli, a floating city into the unknown. He dared not refuse the opportunity Codal had given him. It would be beneath his dignity, and besides, it could arouse suspicion in his enemies. However, recently, when Ocotlan found the weapon of the first captive from Ocotlan, the distant land, he realized that he had no reason to regret what had happened, because with such a weapon, if it should end up in the hands of the Zapotecs, they would not only be able to continue the fight against Aztlan, but to win and achieve peace. Castellan's story had now been added to this discovery. Codal had become Tilatoni of Tlaluacatli malevolently, which meant he had betrayed the Huaytlatoni of Tenochtitlan. Therefore, when he, Ocotlan, finally deposed Codal, he himself would become the Tilatoni of Tlaluacatli, and in the eyes of the Huaytlatoni of Tenochtitlan, he would become a hero who overturned an illegal Tilatoni, liar, and killer. This already opened up new opportunities for promotion in the main city of a huge country, where he could be even better informed about the military plans of the Huaytlatoni Xiacatl. For the past several days, Ocotlan had been concerned about how to find and capture more ticitl who knew how to mine the unknown metal and make their weapons, so he could transport them to Tlaluacatli. As for Tlaluacatli's return to the homeland, there was no need to worry about that. Tlaluacatli would be in the safe hands of Castellan. When the Duke himself had offered them weapons as well as an excuse to drag Codal to the unknown shore of ticitl, Ocotlan had thanked Huitzilopochtli profoundly for all these gifts. At the moment when Codal gave the order to kill the two Tilatoni disputants, Ocotlan was prepared to hit the priest with a deadly blow with obsidian claws that were inserted into the glove on his hand. But just as he was about to attack, thunder rang out. Anacaona screamed in fear and squeezed her eyes shut. And then the deafening thunder rang out again and again. In surprise, Ocotlan crouched down and covered his head with his hands folded over his jaguar fawn helmet. Codal's body fell next to Ocotlan. The priest's head had become a mess of hair, feathers, and blood. Another body fell down behind Ocotlan. Ocotlan raised his head and saw that the Duke was looking at the other Tilatoni, with the man's shirt still grasped in his fist, with such eyes as if he were looking through the other's head at the wall. Life was draining from the Duke's eyes. Ocotlan noticed the opponent's shirt was now covered in blood. Suddenly the body of the Duke, clad in his armor, swayed and fell with a metallic crash, pinning the king. A stream of blood gushed from the throat of the murdered man. Even the king's servants, who helped him ready for bed, did not know about the secret that the monarch went to bed with every night. At one time, the Pope had given his father a gift, a manual mechanism that was invented by some brilliant craftsmen from the Tuscan city of Vinci. Firearms of that time were outfitted with a smoldering wick and a manual mechanism activated by pressing a trigger. However, when the trigger was released on this invention, there was a piece of flint at the end of the cocked spring. This flint struck steel, which created a spark that ignited the gunpowder. A shot rang out. This mechanism was only the size of a palm, and it was convenient to hide. It was a novelty that few people in Portugal knew about, or maybe no one at all except King Afonso. Before his death, King Afonso gave this manual mechanism to his son and taught him how to use it. Since then, Joao always went to bed, hanging this little mechanism from his elbow under his sleeve. He felt that sooner or later this weapon would be useful to him. Things had become very restless since his father had gone to God, and Joao himself had begun to feud with the nobles. Now, as the Duke was strangling him, the king already had this mechanism in his hand ready, and only one thought kept him from shooting. What would the other insurgents gathered in his bedroom do to him after that? Joao shifted his gaze from the giant ship to the south tower where 3 savages stood in clothes that made them look like huge birds, their figures illuminated by the bonfires burning in the courtyard. Joao wanted to shout at himself.
Hurry up. Make up your mind.
He looked at the Duke again. How the king wanted to snatch that stupid scroll out of the Duke's hand and shove it in his mouth. Did he really think that the King of Portugal, who had covered himself with glory on the battlefield, would now be afraid of this elderly idiot, especially at such cost? Joao looked at the other people in his bedroom. His gaze stopped at the doorway.
Well, why are you turning your head, mongrel? What did I say that you didn't understand?
The Duke growled, and Joao saw the barrels of 2 muskets appear in the doorway of his bedroom. Someone had come up the stairs and was now aiming at the people inside the bedroom. 2 figures in nightshirts appeared behind the trunks. It was Daniel and Estela. They moved quietly. No one saw them because everyone was watching the Duke and the king, who was to be thrown over the balcony or beg for mercy. The king met Daniel's eyes. Of course, the Lord God himself, through the Pope and this lucky chance, would save the King of Portugal. Only now Daniel and his daughter were able to see those who were in the room. Daniel pointed Estela at a large, muscular savage, and he took aim at the man's neighbor with the luxurious feathered headdress.
Great,
thought the king.
I'll shoot the Duke, and they'll finish these 2.
It was at this moment that the Duke noticed that smile on the king's face.
This is how I will deal with your Cortez,
said the king, pulling the trigger. A shot rang out. The bullet entered the Duke's head from below, through the throat. After the meeting with the king, Pascual and Chimalli stayed at the castle. The king had decided to keep Chimalli with him for the time being. He could be useful at the next meeting with the navigators. There was no point in putting him in prison. He had already shown himself to be a good-natured, easygoing, and reasonable person. Therefore, the king simply assigned Pascual to Chimalli, who did not have to be asked twice. Both were given an entire barracks for the night, which had been empty since the day the garrison left for the castle of Villa Vicosa in Evora. In the middle of the night, Chimalli got up, sat down on a bedroll spread across a wooden bed, and thought. He was thirsty. Pascual also stood up. Guessing about Chimalli's thirst, he handed him a jug of water, which was right on the table, and then pointed to the courtyard, where he could go relieve himself. It was dark in the barracks. A weak wind stirred the thick curtain on the window, allowing the light of the bonfires burning in the courtyard to penetrate into the room. Pascual returned to his bed and was about to go back to sleep, but suddenly screams and the ringing of swords came from the courtyard. Pascual sat down again, put his feet on the floor, and thought. He was still poorly acquainted with the usual course of life in fortresses and castles. At this hour, his brethren, who inhabited the monastery, of course, were already leaving their rooms for their matins. But would the castle also hold exercises so early? Or else? Then the door burst open and a man with a torch rushed into the barracks. Several more rushed in after him. All these half-naked people had capes, and their heads were protected by helmets made of animal skulls. Pascual immediately realized from their attire that they were Chimalli's tribesmen.
Tupac!
Chimalli exclaimed. He rushed to meet the warrior, and they embraced each other. Another warrior rushed to Pascual, raising a club with plates shining on its end as he ran.
Amo! No!
Chimalli shouted.
Coca amo uidal! Ichkahuipilli! Don't hurt him! This is our friend!
The warrior lowered his club and looked back at Chimalli.
Nay, Iniotli! I'm your friend.
Pascal confirmed, pressing his palms to his chest. He found the strength to smile. The warriors looked in amazement at the strange Tlaluacatli who spoke their language. The precocious Pascal had already figured everything out. These were the people that were fighting with the guards in the courtyard. They must have entered the castle by stealth. Chimalli and the warrior who had broken into the barracks first, Pascal, noticing a tuft of hair tightly tied with a scarlet ribbon on his head, knew each other well. This warrior was saying something quickly to Chimalli, answering questions thrown at him. Pascal managed to make out only 3 words in the warrior's speech, guessing they were names: Ocotlan, Atlatl, and Anacaona. With this last name, Chimalli burst into tears and hugged the warrior, who smiled and patted the old man on the back. Leaving Chimalli and Pascal, the warriors headed deep into the barracks, which, as Pascal already knew, turned into a long corridor with numerous branches.
We need to find your tlacochcalcatl and mine.
Chimalli told Pascal.
My tlacochcalcatl will take me back to Tlaluacatli.
The long horseback ride had tired General Afonso so much that he was cursing that day and hour when he had sworn to his father he would become a military man, and the young soldiers, both mounted and on foot, who followed the general by hundreds, were also exhausted. However, when the stars in the dark blue sky were covered by the black silhouette of the tower, and St. George's Castle was no more than half a league away, the mood of the soldiers began to change. Many, encouraging themselves with curses, walked faster. Some, on the contrary, went limp. The shouts of the sergeants became more frequent and louder. The general only sighed and did not take his eyes off the cherished goal. Suddenly he saw a flash in a window of the tower. Then came the muffled sound of a gunshot. What the hell? The general was wary. Then there was a second shot, a flash, then the sound. And a third shot.
Cavalry, follow me at a trot.
The general shouted.
Infantry, run. Keep up.
Run! Keep up!
The sergeants shouted behind him. Some minutes had passed, and General Afonso's army was finally running towards the castle along the last and steepest stretch of road. The general was relieved to see that the gates were closed, but immediately realized that something was wrong. There was a chilling, noticeable absence of guards, whose silhouettes were usually visible on the wall and towers. The general's anxiety was reinforced by his adjutant, Diego.
Your Grace, do you smell burning?
Burning?
The general asked. His sense of smell had begun to fail him many years ago, but there was nothing surprising about a burning smell because bonfires were always lit in the castle at night.
That's right. A pungent burning smell. It is not the castle bonfires, I can assure you. It's coming from the port, I swear. There's smoke coming from there.
Boom, we will figure it out.
The general muttered. He was already approaching the gate. There were none of the guards who were supposed to be on duty outside at the entrance.
What's going on?
The general began to think, but then an arrow hit the general's steel armor shell. Without hurting him, it jumped away. The general turned around. His squad was showered with arrows shot from the walls.
Put your helmets on.
He shouted.
Spread out.
The commanders of the hundreds were already running up to the general.
Infantry squads. Secure the towers. Wait for attacks from both outside and inside the castle. Squads of archers. Secure the castle and wait for attacks. Cavalry, retreat to the Praca do Comercio and wait for my command there. Execute.
Rush to orders!
The commanders shouted at all voices, returning to their squads.
Your Grace,
Diego asked in amazement.
what is happening? Are we now besieging the king's castle after taking the castle of de Braganza with both our and Braganza's garrisons?
Don't you see? The castle has been captured.
By whom? Excuse me, captured?
Those who shot at us from the wall captured the castle. Fool!
The charge fired from the musket threw Nuno against the wall, and the young man slid down by Anacaona's feet. The torch, which he had been holding in his hand, fell onto the carpet next to him. Anacaona, still stunned by the roar of the shot, rushed to Nuno and saw a terrible wound on his back. He was bleeding. Anacaona, who had been on more than one military campaign with her father, had never seen such terrible and large wounds. It could not have been inflicted by an arrow, spear, or even a macuahuitl with their deadly obsidian blades. Only a jaguar's paw could have delivered such a terrible and deep blow. Anacaona guessed that this wound was related to the thunder she had heard. Turning to the source of the sound, she saw two people in long gray dresses. In their hands, they held some kind of long sticks similar to the atlatl, the devices the warriors used to throw spears and darts to increase their firing power, but these people held them in a very different way than ordinary spearmen. Faint smoke hung in the air. What was it? What did they hit Nuno with? Didn't they hit him with something? Anacaona's nose smelled something new to her. It was a smell not found in nature. It didn't have the power that was in natural odors. In her imagination, this smell appeared dark gray, and the not-so-pretty image was riddled with sharp spikes.
Nuno!
Anacaona turned to Nuno again. She pressed her fingers to the young man's neck and made sure that his heart was still pounding. After examining the large wound on his back, Anacaona immediately realized that no matter what had hit Nuno, he had to be bandaged to stop the blood. Suddenly, a vivid image of another new smell that she had felt in the forest the morning when she first found herself on Ocotlan popped up in her mind. Fancy multicolored patterns painted with bright palettes of colors began to play in her imagination again. But one color, from the new palette, stood out notably in this bizarre pattern. She understood what could help Nuno heal his huge wound. She wasn't able to figure it out right away since she hadn't encountered these smells in the Aztlan jungle. Of course, how could she not know, because this was not a plant, but the bark of a tree that was not commonly found in the jungle where Anacaona grew up, but it was practically everywhere here on Ocotlan. If she rubbed off this bark and mixed it with other medicinal herbs, then this wound would heal quickly. Meanwhile, Ocotlan, deafened by the roar in the bedroom, slowly came to his senses. He had already realized that all his plans had gone to pieces. The man in the black metal Ichkahuipilli, who had promised to give him the weapons, was dead. Another was struggling and squirming under him. It was the tlacochcalcatl the dead man had grabbed by the clothes and tried to strangle. Without thinking twice, Ocotlan rushed over, pulled the struggling man out from under the dead man, and pressed him against the wall, just as the murdered man had done. Unlike de Braganza, Ocotlan wanted nothing more than to strangle this tlacochcalcatl of this big stone house. And this time the king could not shoot. The mechanism was loaded with only one bullet, just like Daniel and Estela's muskets.
Stop!
Daniel shouted. A moment ago, he was still looking at his daughter's petrified face, but Ocotlan's fuss over the bodies of the Duke and the King brought him back to reality. After all, he had ordered Estela to shoot at the giant savage. Why did she shoot Nuno?
Stop now!
Daniel shouted again, looking at Ocotlan. Daniel dropped the useless musket and grabbed his sword with his right hand. The king, whom Ocotlan was pressing against the wall with one hand, was wheezing but still trying to unclench the steel fingers of this giant. Ocotlan's other hand, in a glove equipped with obsidian blades, was raised above the king's head. However, now he had to choose whom to hit first, the tlacochcalcatl or this old man in funny clothes who held his steel macuahuitl in his hand.
You bastard! Let His Majesty go!
Daniel shouted. He did not dare to strike the savage with a sword. Who knew if the savage might really kill the king with the last of his strength in response? Ocotlan was not afraid of either man. However, he was tormented by the question of what killed Codal and the young Tlaluacatli who already understood their language. What were those loud noises that had rendered him slightly deaf? Were they connected with the fact that both the young man and Codal were now lying on the floor? But this was some kind of wonderful weapon if it was a weapon. Yes, yes, and Ocotlan and his people would need such weapons. Who could translate his demands into the language of Tlaluacatli if the young man were to die? Ocotlan saw several eagles running across the courtyard, breaking into the towers that led up to the castle walls as they were fitting arrows to their bows. Behind the wall, from the side of the city, a lot of soldiers in light metal Ichkahuipilli were also rushing toward the tower while others sat on their big animals. Neither Ocotlan nor his warriors were afraid of these animals anymore. They had already met them more than once while running through the streets to this huge stone house on the hill, and they knew that these animals could be frightened by simply clapping hands in front of their muzzles. But there were a lot of these people riding animals, a myriad of them. Without a fight, it would not be possible to leave the city and get to Tlaluacatli. Ocotlan understood what kind of power these soldiers represented, and he was afraid of their weapons.
I swear to the Virgin Mary, if you don't let the king go, I'll send you to the hell you came from right now.
Daniel shouted. He approached the balcony where Ocotlan held Joao II. Ocotlan turned around and Daniel swung his sword in front of the giant's nose. And suddenly Ocotlan realized what their salvation would be. As long as the Atlatl of Ocotlan was in the hands of Ocotlan and his warriors, neither the people surrounding the castle nor this old man with a steel macuahuitl would dare to harm them. Ocotlan opened his hand. The half-strangled king sank to the floor of the balcony and began to gulp air greedily.
It's all your fault!
Estela shouted. She had only now come to her senses after what she did. Anacaona turned around. Her face was distorted by a grimace of hatred. Anacaona recognized this girl who had come to Nuno's house and showed her the ribbon Tupac had lost. Anacaona realized she was the one who had just hurt Nuno.
If you hadn't come to us, no one would have died here.
Estela screamed again. She threw her strange stick at Anacaona. Anacaona ducked. The stick flew over her head and hit the wall.
Damn you!
Estela hissed. She rushed at Anacaona, but Anacaona was quicker and easily dodged her hands. The games Anacaona had played since childhood were now helping her out. Estela slammed into the wall with her whole body and screamed, but immediately turned around and rushed at Anacaona again. This time, Estela got hit in the face, but she still managed to grab Anacaona's hair in her fists. Both girls fell to the floor, rolled out onto the stairs, and landed right at the feet of Chimalli and Tupac, who, together with the jaguars, were running up to the fray. The jaguars tore Estela away from Anacaona and shoved her away, threatening her with their pikes. Other warriors rushed to Daniel and Joao and tied them up with harvested vines. Anacaona and Chimalli hugged and cried. Chimalli took Anacaona's face in his hands and said the most tender words he was capable of. After she stopped crying, Anacaona took Chimalli by the hand, led him to Nuno, and pointed to the unconscious young man. Chimalli saw pain and grief in the girl's eyes. Chimalli understood everything.
Your Grace,
Shouted Diego.
look!
General Afonso, who was fiercely inspecting his soldiers lined up in a chain on the way to the city, turned around. The south gate of St. George's Castle was wide open. A crowd of half-naked dark-skinned people, richly decorated with feathers and capes made of animal skins, came through them. The crowd bristled with pikes and strange weapons resembling clubs. In the center of the crowd was a man in a nightgown. These savages pointed spears and knocked arrows at him. A knife was also held at the throat of the man. General Afonso was horrified to recognize King Joao II of Portugal as this prisoner. The group that led him was surrounded by a chain of other warriors whose heads were covered with helmets made of jaguar skulls.
Lower your weapons.
Afonso commanded.
Everyone stand still. Let's let them pass.
The soldiers lowered their swords, pikes, and crossbows. When the king was escorted past them, they bowed, then raised their heads and followed the procession with frightened glances. The townspeople who had managed to run to the castle behaved the same way. The king saw Afonso and caught his eye.
They came on a ship with 1,000 cannons.
The king shouted.
Their ship is in port on the Tagus. Let them through. Don't stop them from getting out of here.
Diego,
Afonso commanded.
order our people to go ahead of them. Have them warn everyone they meet not to get involved in the fight. As long as the king is in their hands, we are powerless against them.
The crowd continued to march onward. Soon, the line of warriors of Aztlan entered the city center. Shouts and howls were heard as the townspeople recognized their king, in only his nightgown, in the center of the crowd descending to the port. No one could understand what was happening to him. It was clear the king was not walking of his own free will because a knife was held at his throat. Some of the townspeople recognized the savages who led the king as servants of hell. That was how they were depicted on the icons in the churches. Were they really devils, and were they taking the king away from them? Was this not the end of the world? Acting on impulse, many citizens threw everything they had at hand from the upper floors and roofs into the line of dark-skinned warriors. Chairs, benches, flower pots, tubs, and kitchen utensils. The bravest even poured the contents of night vessels on the strangers. From time to time the savages answered them with well-aimed shots from bows, after which the death cries of the unfortunate joined the noise of the procession. But the aliens did not allow themselves to be intimidated either. They let out war cries and shouts of victory, which were immediately echoed by all of the warriors. When the warriors approached the Praça do Comércio, an elderly commoner ran out of the last alley and crashed into their crowd. She was armed with a sword taken from somewhere, but in the morning twilight, the savages failed to notice her weapon. Making her way to the king, she pushed aside the crowd of half-naked warriors with her body. Confused in their surprise, they gave way to her. Finally, the warriors tried to grab the woman by the arms, and she raised her sword over her head and struck the nearest warrior with it. He collapsed, bleeding profusely, and the blows of dozens of terrible clubs immediately fell on the woman. The body of the brave townswoman disappeared among the stream of feathers, skins, and animal skulls. Finally, the crowd reached the center of Praça do Comércio located at the port where the garrison cavalry was stationed. The square was the gem of the city, spacious and fenced on three sides by two-story white houses with red-tiled roofs. These houses stood close to each other, forming walls. The first floors were occupied by shopping stalls, decorated with a series of low arches for access. The fourth, undeveloped side of the square harmoniously turned into a pier. The cavalrymen hugged the necks of their horses, stood silently, and gritted their teeth. They had been ordered not to attack the warriors. Many of them, for fear of succumbing to temptation, hid their horses in the passages and now looked gloomily out of the arches. Aztlan's warriors, realizing their impunity, took weapons away from a few of the king's soldiers. One of the cavalrymen broke his crossbow in front of the warriors in order to keep it out of their hands and promptly paid for it with his life. A whole fleet of boats was waiting for the warriors at the pier. The first several dozen boarded boats and went to their ship, which was at the mouth of the Tagus. At night, when landing on the shore, the boats had sailed several times from the ship to the shore, delivering new detachments of warriors, but now no one waited for the return of the boats. The warriors began to seize the boats and small vessels of the townspeople. The shouts, whistles, and hooting of the savages announced them to the port and its surroundings. Some of the fishermen and seafaring merchants, who did not want to part with their goods, tried to recapture their boats and longboats from the strangers, but they were all destined to fall in the unequal battle. The luckiest sailors were just thrown into the water. The king was taken away in the last boat. It was rowed to the ship surrounded by a dozen other boats filled with warriors in bird feathers and Portuguese captives. The eyes of Joao, who was sitting in the boat, and General Afonso, who remained on the shore, met. Nuno came to his senses and opened his eyes. Above him was a bright blue clear sky. A gusty wind, saturated with the smells of the sea, beat on the young man's face. Nuno's back hurt so much that he groaned. He tried to get up, but the pain was unbearable. Nuno lay down again. Where was he? Overcoming the pain, Nuno turned his head and saw the pyramid. He was on the Tlaluacatli ship. Nuno looked along the base of the pyramid and saw that warriors were lying at the stern. There were so many of them, and they all seemed to be moaning. The bodies of the warriors were covered with bloody scabs. Among the injured warriors, there were people who offered them water and food, but almost all refused to eat. The faces of the unfortunate warriors were speckled with black spots. From time to time, people walking between the warriors picked up another lifeless body and threw it overboard. Those lying there had been struck by some unknown disease. Nuno turned his head the other way. Anacaona was next to him. Nuno did not recognize her immediately because her face and hands, the entire surface of her body, were covered with black spots. These spots even concealed the tattoos on Anacaona's face. Her eyes were closed, but she was breathing. Nuno tried to get up again and again but could not do it. He looked at his side and saw that Anacaona was squeezing his hand. She must have grasped it before she fell into oblivion. Anacaona had been with Nuno every minute since he was shot in the back and lost consciousness at St. George's Castle. Nuno squeezed Anacaona's hand and she opened her eyes. A faint smile appeared on the girl's face.
Now you are my slave, Nuno.
She whispered.
I captured you.
Nuno replied. He started to laugh, but immediately stopped and coughed, the pain in his back immediately spreading throughout his body. Then a shadow fell across his face, and Nuno saw a young man in a brown monk's robe in front of him. He had blonde hair and blue eyes.
I don't believe my eyes.
The young man said with a smile.
Maybe I could become a good doctor, and then I could take out all sorts of pieces of iron and lead from people.
With these words, the young man showed Nuno a large round bullet and laughed. Then he looked somewhere to the side and shouted in the foreign language that Nuno already understood.
Chimalli, he's alive! Examine him and bring the new ointment that Anacaona made. The wound heals very quickly.
Then the young man turned back to Nuno.
My name is Pascal. I'll help you. Don't dare to die here. Our journey is just beginning.
Historical notes. After Ichkahuipilli, the Aztec Empire was ruled by both of his older brothers in turn. This time is considered the golden age of the heyday of the empire. The Zapotec civilization withstood a continuous struggle with the Aztec Empire and was conquered only by the conquistadors half a century later. The accuracy of the Mayan and Aztec calendars still causes admiration and controversy among historians and astronomers. Duke Fernando II de Braganza was executed by order of Joao II on June 20, 1483, in the Vila Vicosa castle of the city of Evora. His title and possessions were confiscated, and the family fled to Castile. After the death of Joao II, his family returned to their homeland. Until now, the Braganza dynasty is the most famous in Portugal. Joao II ruled until 1495 and died at the age of 40 without leaving an heir. With his support, a large number of voyages were made, which many centuries later will be called the Age of Discovery. Bartolomeu Dias was the first European to circumnavigate Africa and reach the Indian Ocean in 1488. 10 years later, in 1498, his countryman Vasco da Gama will make the first sea crossing from Europe to India in the world. Vasco da Gama's flagship on his third trip to India will be the Santa Catarina Carrack, already built at Portuguese shipyards in India. Joao II will refuse to support Christopher Columbus's voyage to the west, who will soon after move from Portugal to Castile. There Christopher Columbus enlisted the support of Queen Isabella I and discovered America in 1492 under the flag of Castile. Ironically, on the way from the newly discovered lands back to Castile, his first stop will be the port of Lisbon, where he will meet Joao II again and personally tell him that he had reached India. The fact that this is not India but America, humanity will find out 10 years later, in 1502, when another great navigator from Florence, Amerigo Vespucci, with the help of Columbus maps and on Portuguese ships, will study the east coast of modern South America and prove that this is not India, but a new continent. 20 years after that, the Aztec Empire will cease to exist.